Welcome to another Open Democracy Tedworth podcast. This is Tony Curzon-Price. This two-part interview with Roger Scruton was recorded on Monday the 10th of February 2014 in London. It's a conversation sparked off by his new novel about Czech dissidents in the early 1980s, Notes from Underground. Part 1 runs for about 15 minutes and Part 2 runs for about 25. Part 2.
Prague in the late 70s, early 80s, communist Prague, which is where most of the novel unfolds, is a Prague you knew.
Yes.
And the rest of the novel is written from the perspective of someone sitting in a rather comfortable office in Washington in the early 21st century, which is also somewhere you knew. Yeah. Now, I just wanted to ask you what the relationship of the novel is to the lived reality of those places.
Well, certainly about Prague in the 1980s, obviously I have very intense experiences of that time, and when I used to travel there, only ever for short periods, because one risked arrest. In fact, I was finally arrested, but nevertheless, for that very reason, the intensity of these experiences was enormous, and I got to know people and thought about it and worked from a distance with the people there. And I think what I have created is the atmosphere of that time, and not just the emotional atmosphere, but the possibilities that people had. That's something that most interested me, especially about young people, feeling the fact that everywhere all the avenues were closed to them. The avenues that were being opened to me and my contemporaries in England, they just didn't exist. And seeing young people, as were caught in these mazes which led to dead ends all around them, was a very moving and disturbing experience. So that's what I tried to capture with Jan and Betka. And the unusual thing about Betka, of course, is that she has opened a door, but we don't discover quite what it is.
So that's on the Prague side, but Jan is Jan is very critical of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, but he's also very critical of the America that he discovers. Yeah. He's saying neither communist Prague nor liberal democratic Washington, and that's actually something that runs through. That's a theme that runs through the book. Is your criticism of both?
Well, it's not my criticism. Remember, this is Jan talking. I'm much more lenient towards Washington than he, but you have to remember that he is somebody who's come out of a place where his experience was constrained. He's marked by it for life. He's never really able to enjoy that, the possibilities of Washington, because his own curmudgeonly nature that is preventing him.
Jan is very critical of America. So, for example, I live here in the aftermath of unalterable things. And from those things I learnt the lesson of Spinoza, that freedom is the consciousness of necessity. Here, in the land of the free, all can be altered, and freedom is never achieved. Willingly would I abandon this life of multiple choices.
Yes. That, I think you have to see that in the context of his story. What he's effectively saying is that there is a kind of freedom which is granted to us only when we are fully alive, prepared to give ourselves, prepared also to receive the same gift from another. And that happened to him with Betka in that one moment. And yet, of course, it was taken from him. But it was a sense of his own, of the fullness of his own life and of his preparedness to make a gift of it. That was what he's referring to. The consciousness that this is coming from within him and that there is nothing but what he must do. And of course, it's in a sense, it all goes wrong for reasons that the reader discovers. But what he's trying to say is that is a completely different thing from the kind of supermarket freedom in which you have multiple choices at every moment, but none of them has any particular meaning for you, because none of them is, as it were, existentially involved in the very thing that you are.
This is something which you repeated, which in various ways you point up as being a characteristic of 21st century Western consumerism.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm trying to put across is partly that the very deprivations of those young people in 1980s Prague were actually opened the way to this other kind of sense of freedom if they were prepared to take the risk, and go for it. That for them, there were very few choices of a consumerist kind, but there were these other choices, whether to take the great risks, to give themselves to each other, and to try and make out of that relationship something which was full.
And so at least Jan's judgment, and maybe it goes towards your judgment, is that supermarket freedom, that freedom of multiple choices, is not a particularly valuable political virtue.
Well, I'd want to say that it is valuable, but it should never be permitted to erase the other freedom, the deep freedom that we have to be ourselves completely, and I'm talking really in a sort of existentialist way here, that that you can live with a sense of illusory freedom through constantly making choices which have no meaning beyond the moment, but there's that other thing that we all want, which is the giving of oneself to something which instills meaning into one's life.
Jan comes to the conclusion that the way out of the underground, he says at one point, is going to be personal and not political.
Yeah, that's right.
So what I'd be interested in hearing, and actually I have something from your other very fascinating book, Green Philosophy, what the relationship is between that view that the way out from meaninglessness is personal, yet it requires love, which after all is not a person. It's more than one. It's social. Yeah. And then in Green Philosophy, as you talk about these same themes, you say only where people have a strong sense of who we are, why we are acting in this way or that, why we have behaved rightly in one respect, wrongly in another, will they be so involved in the collective decisions as to adopt them as their own. The first person plural is the precondition of a political as opposed to a sacred order.
Well, yes. That's totally true, that last bit. That's me speaking, not Betka.
Not Betka or Jan. Okay. Right. So in a sense, Jan and Betka in their obsession with the personal, yes, and with this personal assertive stance against meaninglessness, have got a big piece of the jigsaw missing, is it?
That's absolutely true, but it's been taken from them. You see, that's another way of putting what was wrong with the whole communist situation, was that there was no first person plural. There was no we. There was me and my circle, and there was them. It was an impersonal they that controlled things. It wasn't our doing, we Czechs or anything like that. And yet, people like Jan and Betka are hungry for that first person plural. Where can it begin? It can only begin between you and me, so to speak, between the individuals. And so they were in the business of creating their own little we. Their own, and that's what all those seminars were about. All those explorations of networks, which proved, of course, incredibly fragile, precisely because they could never embody themselves in a political order.
You mentioned Philip Roth's account of this world, which is more or less at the same time. It happens more or less at the same time as Notes from the Underground, which is in his little novella Prague Orgy. What comes clear in his novella is the celebration of Zuckerman's own personal drama. The we which Jan finds lacking in Washington, it's not as if Roth says, well, here it is. Roth says what gives meaning to Zuckerman's existence is being the good son, is publishing Yiddish stories, it's his own psychodrama.
Yeah.
Is that the choice? You have a we taken away from you in communist Czechoslovakia, and you have personal psychodrama in New York. Is that the either or would you still stand with Jan and Betka and say neither?
You're forcing, you're pushing this towards a hugely difficult area, which I didn't. My novel was not meant to be an answer to these deep questions as to what remains to us in a post-religious world, whatever it is, or in the postmodern world. I would say simply that what I say in Green Philosophy is true. That there has to be this first-person plural if there is to be collective decision-making and collective sense of responsibility. And without that collective sense of responsibility, the whole environmental cause is lost. I would say that, and I give an argument for thinking that first-person plural must flower, at least in the national sphere, the sphere of what is ours politically and so on, what is ours by virtue of our membership of a particular historical community and all the things that we actually in our hearts know to be true. But they, Jan and Betka, did not have that available to them, and that was part of the huge loneliness that frequented the streets of Prague, the sense that these everybody who walked in them was actually haunting them. They were not present there, not fully present there, because it didn't belong to anyone. It was the unowned quality of this whole environment that afflicted people most severely, and that's what Jan initially experiences, and her appearance in his life was sort of, as it was smashing into it, just like that, completely changes everything for him, because suddenly it seems to him that maybe there is a form of belonging available after all, but only through her, and she's constantly reminding him of this, that something is needed, something more than just the personal, which is why she has, she's lost herself, she's interested herself in the whole tradition of Czech music, and she knows literature, she knows the past of her country. She's even tried to recreate a little bit of it in her Moravian hideout, and that's the sort of thing which shows that she is more fully alive than him.
Yes, the descriptions of her farmhouse are very beautiful, and of course remind me a little bit of the farmhouse that you've created.
Well, yeah.
Betka has a huge capacity for creating spaces, interiors, creating homes, and it seems to me that this is something that you share with your character.
Oh, that's very nice. Yes, she's a much more interesting person than me, but yeah.
Betka has some harsh words for Charter 77, doesn't she? This is her view of it. The Charter was, in Betka's view, a piece of half-baked philosophy composed in the same newspeak as the official protocols of the ruling party, with its invocation of progressive forces, human development, and 100 other dead words meaning progress, and therefore nothing at all like a speech on May Day.
Yes, that's very good of her. That's typical Betka. It's not me speaking.
No. But how much? But
she's right.
So you talk, or you and the book talks a lot about newspeak.
Yeah.
These words, progress, etc.
Yeah. The thing what Betke sees is, I think, something very important, and a lot of people did see it then, which is that Newspeak is extremely difficult to escape from. That even the language of the opposition was poisoned by it, and that's one of the things that turned people in a way towards religion. The religion provided a vocabulary that was pure from this point of view. It wasn't infected by Newspeak. If you try and formulate everything in a political charter or political protest, as people did, where did you get your vocabulary from? All you had in your education was the Marxist texts, and the positive words were things like progress, the future, and solidarity. Why did the Polish movement of resistance call itself solidarity? That was one of the accepted communist words. You could call yourself that, and this language was polluted, and Betke was really just making this point.
But the pollution seems to go beyond the communist world. You have a Rotian character, Professor Günther, who appears as part of the human rights industry. And one of the things you say about him is, true belief we learnt is the useful belief, the one that enables you to affirm the rights of your group and to gain the illuminated plateau of liberation. Truth means power, etc. I recalled our official doctrine, according to which the power of the party and the truth of its theories are one and the same. And by the time Günther told us that claims to human rights, whenever made by a community in search of liberation, are inherently justified, my head was spinning out of control. Whose side was he on?
Well, this is something which I independently of this book, which I think is extremely important, that Orwell have perceived this in 1984, that it was important it's important in any totalitarian government to control thought and to control truth, to make truth and power somehow elide into each other.
So Foucault was right.
So they coalesce. Well, and then, of course, you get these theories, like Foucault's theories in Les Mots et les Choses, which say that is true, that there is no other view, it goes back to Marx and the theory of ideology, that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. They are the ideas which maintain the power of that class. Foucault rewrote this by saying, that the episteme of any epoch, in other words, the received views and the concepts used to express them, are there because they enhance and perpetuate the power of the ruling or the ruling structure of domination and so on.
But there's a remarkable amount of that which your novel seems to endorse as a view of the world, because after all, you have that clearly the case in communist Czechoslovakia. You have that in Jan's view of it in liberal America. Of course, your characters fight it.
Yeah,
but the description seems to be endorsed.
Orwell does not endorse it in 1984. He just says that look how difficult it is to escape from this when people do it. What Foucault does is make it look as though you could never escape from this because this is the way the world is. And Rorty does the same. This is why I have my visiting American professor is a Rortian and is a Dworkinian about rights and all this sort of thing. He is actually showing something which I believe to be true, namely that this kind of manipulation of the world of ideas in the interests of power occurs even when you think that the power in question is the right one, the one that gives power to the people rather than to the ruling ruling structures, and I think that's what Jan perceives, that he's really caught in this, and that there is a huge problem as to how to get out of it. So you're speaking with with pure thoughts which are guided by truth alone.
Father Pavel, is another complicated character full of secrets, but you have him as clearly someone who wants to help others. He wants to be involved in other people's lives. So in that sense, he's the opposite of Betka.
Yeah.
He's an underground priest. In communist Czechoslovakia, he becomes a member of the Civic Forum as soon as the wall comes down. He's always bringing people together.
That's right. I mean, this is an aspect of those days and that society which people now hardly know about. It's just all fading from memory, but the underground church was hugely important in Eastern Europe in the communist days. Not originally, but it became tremendously important after the election of Pope Wojtyła to the papacy. So there was a Polish pope, and the church in Poland became electric, obviously, with this. But the feelings that generated spread across the border into Czechoslovakia. And many people were drawn into the Catholic Church, especially young people. And there were, of course, underground priests for the very reason that the church, the Archbishop, Cardinal Archbishop of Prague, had refused to compromise. He'd refused to acknowledge the authenticity of the communist movement in the church, which had the Pacem in Terris movement, and so had effectively excommunicated those priests, so that the most important priests were working underground. Father Pavel, the character I create for him is that of another kind of existentialist, someone who's in fact a follower of Simon Weil, the French mystical Catholic, whose writings are actually extraordinarily relevant to what was going on then. Her vision of the Roman Catholic faith was roughly this: that because we couldn't find God in this world in any easy way, certainly not in the modern world, because everything seemed to be completely as though ungoverned by any superior force, it must be that God has withdrawn. Indeed, as soon as you realise that, you understand that he must withdraw in order to be found. And so that is his way of saying it's up to you to find me, and to make religion once again into the centre of people's lives, as it couldn't be if he was so easily available as in the ordinary ongoing medieval church that history tells us about.
Which is, of course, an aspect of Weil's original Judaism, is the disappearing God of the Old Testament.
Absolutely. And Father Pavel has been obviously tremendously impressed by this, because it engages with his own experience as somebody whose priesthood has led him deeper and deeper into trouble and into prison and so on.
But he reappears, and he reappears not as a priest, but as a civil society organizer.
Absolutely, that's another part of this great transition that people don't understand now. That it was not just a tradition from oppression to freedom. It was a transition from two completely different phenomenologies. A world in which you looked for meaning despite all the meaningless all around you, and you could find it, into a world where meaning was available in 25 varieties on every supermarket shelf, but nobody was particularly interested.
One of the things you oppose and contrast to Betka's assertive meaning-making is the attitude of most of the rest of the dissidents in the book. You have this description of them here, as Jan is thinking about Patočka's drastic words, mixing philosophical technicalities, frightening invocations of an all-encompassing destruction. They were like spells summoning the ghosts of our ruined country into the room, and around me I sensed the held breath, the intense stares into nothing that bound us together in a conspiracy of apartness. This conspiracy of apartness is the solidarity of the shattered.
Yeah, that there, yes, because of course such people didn't know what they had in common apart from that. You know, they were people who had been washed up, as it were, in these seminars, who all of whom had lost whatever it might have been that would have given them a full life in the communist system. And you know, it was precisely this sense of loss which united them, a sense that there was something else that they should have had, which they didn't have. The difference between the people who have a sense of loss and the rest is that the others have just as much loss, but no sense of it.
And of course, one of the corollaries of a sense of loss is to try and remedy it.
Yes, exactly.
Which is a transformation of the world and not just a...
Exactly. That is the theme of this book, Notes from Underground. It is, in the end, it's consciousness. The one thing that we have, even in that situation that Jan is describing at the beginning, what they cannot take from him is consciousness, the consciousness of the things around him, which he can order, at least, and try to order and try to assemble in something that makes sense to him. And he does it at first through his fantasies and through his stories of their lives, but then what Bethke gives him is the thought that he can be conscious of this thing as something in which he is fully real.
That brings to an end part 2 of my conversation with Roger Scruton. His novel, Notes from Underground, is published by Beaufort Books in New York and is available on Amazon and in ebook format. You can read an extract on Open Democracy, where you can also find part 1 of this interview.